Welcome back, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. It's the monthly AVH webinar study group, and this month is our pleasure and honor to welcome back Dr. Gregory Pays, who's going to regale us after we finish talking about the kidding that a guest sparrow just did. Well, that's right. No, I'm sorry. You were talking about your
Well, we were
story.
we were in the middle of a couple different stories, so I'll leave I'll leave the story of the quadruplets for another time. So, uh, yeah, did you want to say more, Jeff, or should I just dive in?
Oh no, just dive in. I didn't know if homeopathy was involved in either kidding story.
All right. Yeah. So this is as people are gathering together and sitting down and muting the background so we don't hear anything going on, and the first couple of minutes here, I wanted to say a little bit about Sparrow, uh, because for us, she's a bit of a unique animal in the herd. Um, my wife Hillary has been raising Nubian goats since '99. Most of that time in Pennsylvania until we left in 2014, and then since then as well. Here we are in the mountains of Colorado. And what's special about Sparrow is the first thing I remember about Sparrow is Phil telling me that we had a virgin milker, which I could kind of figure out what that meant, but I had never actually heard the term before, meaning that she was producing milk without being bred. And so that was, that was for me, kind of got my attention. I didn't, think to treat that homeopathic or in any other way. And in the beginning, it was more observation. What we the first thing that I actually the first illness that I actually did treat in Sparrow with the help of Dr. Susan Beal, dear friend and comrade in arms here, was pretty severe. Oh, actually, the worst case of iritis I've ever seen. Severe enough that it blinded her in the right eye. But under the effects of a homeopathic medicine, over the course of 2 months, the blindness receded, and she had then and still has full vision in that right eye. So that was that was quite an amazing journey there. And perhaps if I ever had the time to write up the case, and Phil actually can find the notes from Sparrow's history. I prescribe the remedies, but I make her do all the note taking, since I've got to do my human practice for my own note taking. But then the next part of Sparrow here that applies directly to this picture is that within the first year, she developed quite hard udder, also on the right side, and very nodular, very lumpy. In Phil's description, when she was, palpating the udder and not only feeling the hardness, but feeling the lumpiness as well. And again, observing her symptoms, getting as much from Phil as I can, because for any of the animals that I've treated over the years, Phil, for the most part, is my eyes and ears. I don't spend the time in the barn with them, whether it's been the Nubian goats or the Angora goats, or the dogs for that matter, to some extent, that Phil spends. So through her, asking her questions and getting her to observe what happened with Sparrow, again with some help from Susan, prescribed the remedy conium for Sparrow. And for me, it's the best case of conium. I've prescribed conium in the past without much in the way of results with humans, but just this wonderful result over the course again of a couple of months with Sparrow, with her udder normalizing, the induration of the udder, the hardness gradually changing so that it became soft, and the lumps gradually getting softer and less specific, and just kind of fading into the background of the udder, such that once she was bred, we were pretty confident that she'd be able to nurse her kids once she gave birth without any problems. So a completely normal right udder after the effects of conium, other than the fact that that udder is still larger than the other udder is. And try saying that 10 times really fast. So here's Sparrow with her first kidding, a boy and a girl. And this is the tiny little bit of pasture that we have for them. And you can see the block in the background and the bottom end of the barn door. On the property here. So just, like I said, I was compelled to share this with everyone, figuring that, everyone on the call could really appreciate the effects of remedy with animals, and certainly any kind of production animal. You're always happy to see that. Not only the fact that Sparrow's healthy and her kids are healthy and able to nurse, but Phil is quite the accomplished cheese maker after all these years, both hard cheese and soft cheese. So we only have a small amount of land here for the Nubians. So if we keep any Nubians, they have to be, for just to make it work economically, they have to be producers, and so that Phil can, we can do the milking and she can make the cheese from them. So that's my latest animal success story, and the second really significant illness that we treated Sparrow for. So thanks for the indulgence, everybody, to let me talk a little bit about Sparrow here as we start.
I think it's great, Gregory, with that, just as you gather up your thoughts, is that, she exteriorized her symptoms, and she also through the course of that, we didn't nail that prescription first off, for sure, in that assessment of the wrong prescription, not to steal your thunder, but it was neat that she exteriorized that really bad uveitis to a really amazing mastitis, udder swelling stuff.
And just to see that progression, over the years, I know that it means, that the next health issue that if we do have to work with Sparrow again, that this track record, as you say, the exteriorization of the symptoms, the wrong remedy prescription, which isn't actually a part of tonight's discussion, but to see that process, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a few minutes, to see that process and know how to utilize that moving forward for whatever happens, the next the next rung on the ladder for her as far as things go. But at the moment, she's pretty healthy. So tonight's discussion is about assessing the wrong prescription. And this is actually a small, it's about, a tenth information-wise of an excerpt from a course that I produced last year. And so I'm basically taking a part of it, something that I thought might be helpful, useful, and interesting for you folks to hear this evening. Just a tiny little bit about me. For those of you that haven't been on the call before, I've actually done 2 previous AVH webinars. I am a naturopathic doctor. I've been in practice since 1993. The letters there, DHAMP, means that I'm board certified in classical homeopathy by the Homeopathic Academy of Naturopathic Physicians, and I've held my DHAMP since '97. If you do have any questions, something you want to you have interest in, ask me about, there's the best email to reach me by, and my phone number as well, if that's useful. So why a class on failure? It's even in my initial desire to create this class, to create the course that this class is an excerpt of. It's a little bit difficult because you don't, I definitely have an ego, and as a practitioner, you don't ever want to think about that you fail, right? That you did something, you tried to help someone, and either they didn't respond or they didn't get better, or whatever your definition of failure is. Because we love to talk about our cured cases. Everybody loves to talk about miracles, and I love to talk about miracles too. There's that book series, The Miracle of the Minimum Dose. The first book, and then more miracles of the minimum dose, and those are some great cases. In those books, for an introduction to homeopathy and homeopathic practice, it's certainly wonderful, and we need that. We need those miracles, especially in the beginning, to keep us motivated, to keep us moving along down the path of studying and practice. But if all you ever hear are successes, then the implication is that there aren't any failures, and that's just not true. I run into failures in my practice. I have in the past. I imagine I will in the future. Hopefully, they get further and further apart. Years ago, I used to tell folks, I hope that after about 25 years, that I'm not bad as a homeopathic practitioner, but give me 30 years, 35, 40 years, and I'll get even better. So we all make mistakes in practice. I've been sick, and I know that the anamnesis I took that particular day with patients, probably I needed to go back and clarify some questions. We're in a hurry, and we don't take all the time that we might want to take to research the prescription that we make. Game of Thrones is on, or whatever other distraction that you have, so that we skip studying the materia medica. We don't go into depth. We choose our favorite secondary source. Maybe it's Nash's Leaders, maybe it's George Vathoukas' Materia Medica, but we don't go back to the original proving information to look at the remedy that we want to prescribe. And talking about Hahnemann, in his case books, he had patients come one time and never return. And I've heard practitioners, actually present that as a good response, because, they say, if I gave the remedy and the patient didn't get back, so that must mean that the patient got better. Otherwise, they'd get a hold of me. But in my experience, that is not true, at least not all the time. I've had patients come once, prescribed a remedy, and I've never heard back from them. And I'll reach out actually and ask the patients by, I'll ask them what happened, why they didn't return. Sometimes the answer is they don't have they don't have enough money. Something happened in the family and they can't come back. Sometimes it's a different family issue. Somebody's giving them a hard time for pursuing homeopathy. So that because of that pressure from a family member, that's why they didn't come back. Yeah. Yes, it does happen that you prescribe one remedy one time, one dose, and they're 90% better plus. So they feel, oh, I don't have to return for the follow-up, and I don't need to tell the doctor that I got better because I'm better. That definitely does happen, but it also happens that they didn't respond to that first dose, or at least that's the perception. So their thought was, well, it didn't work, quote unquote, so I'm going to go to the next thing. I'll go to the Reiki healer, or I'll go to the the acupuncturist, or I'll go to the craniosacral therapist, as they kind of doctor shop their way, down the line to try and address the issue. And the other part to this is that I would suggest it's useful to reach out and find out why that patient didn't come back after that first visit. Okay. So also true for Hahnemann is that patients didn't get better, so they just decided not to go back. Right? Why waste their time and money? And of course, that's Hahnemann we're talking about. Uh, he also treated some patients for years, literally years, without improvement. And if you can find people that have access to Hahnemann's Paris casebooks, you'll see this. Some patients had aggravations, and that's why they never returned to work with Hahnemann. I saw this in a somewhat altered form in my initial years in practice. When I was first in practice, the very first year, it was in an area where there was what I think of as a fourth edition of the Organon prescriber, but with a strong Kentian influence, who I would get his patients after his prescription because they had horrendous aggravations, and his feedback was, we don't repeat the dose of the remedy until you get better. These refugees from his practice that I saw, they were the ones that didn't work for. They had aggravations and they didn't get better. Some of those folks had aggravations for longer than a year based on that prescription that they were given. I don't know if that was the detail for Hahnemann's practice. He was always, his effort was always to produce the most rapid, gentle, and permanent cure. I've never looked at his casebooks firsthand. I don't read German. One of these times, I'm going to go to the Bosch library in Germany with my German-speaking patient from Hamburg, and I'm going to ask her to do some interpretation for me. So for all these reasons and more, I think it's appropriate to consider, the different aspects that happen when you don't see a good remedy response. So these are the learning objectives from that overall course that I'm referencing here. First off, I think it's really important to understand what can be cured and what can't be cured. And various homeopaths have a different opinion on what that means. But I think it's useful to read some of the articles that Dr. Andre Sain has written on this subject, because I think he has a really good take. He's been in practice for a long time. He pretty much only works with serious chronic disease, life-threatening chronic disease. So I think he has a pretty good impression from all his years in practice, what can and can't be cured. And certainly you can find this in some of the old literature as well. That leads you right into the question, can homeopathy cure everyone? And I'd like to think that we can, that there isn't anything that homeopathy can't treat and can't potentially cure. But in my own practice, I've had patients who, they maybe homeopathy would work for them, but it sure wasn't working for them being in my practice, for them working with me. There was something about my aspect as a practitioner that just didn't work for them. And the classic case I have of this is the patient who stood up in my office, a very small woman, and leaned over my desk with her hand in my face about, I don't know, maybe 6 inches, 4 inches from my face, shaking her finger at me. I can still see the finger moving in front of my face, where she was very unhappy with homeopathic care that she'd gotten at that point. And so I suggested to her, because of her disappointment in care, that, she search for a different homeopath. That my work as a naturopathic doctor with her, with my focus in homeopathy, just wasn't working for her. And the funny thing was, as soon as I said that, she sat down and said, well, that's a problem, because I think you have to work with me. So at the same point that she was telling me that it wasn't working, she wasn't really willing to let go of the, at least not in that moment. Right? An issue that I don't see a lot, but I'm actually beginning to question more based on some good feedback from homeopaths like David Kramer and other practitioners. I think I have to consider more that sometimes when I prescribe a good remedy, that my remedy, the actual remedy itself is defective, meaning that there isn't, that there isn't something there that needs to be there as far as the remedy goes. And I don't know, moving forward, I'm not quite sure how I'm going to use this filter, but just some conversations, as I say, with some really excellent homeopaths over the last few months has just made me consider that more. I've always been of the opinion that either the remedy works or it doesn't work, and the patient's going to let me know that one way or the other, because they're not going to waste their time working with me and actually lie to me to tell me that the remedy is working when it isn't. The couple of times when I thought that was happening, I stepped out of that situation really quickly by referring that patient to someone else. But literally, that's only happened once or twice in over a quarter century of practice that I've identified that someone was actually out and out lying to me. Antidotes are a big facet of what happens when you think you have a wrong remedy choice, or it's actually a failed prescription. And I've covered antidotes in previously, not quite as in depth as we might do now, but that's a big one. And I'm not sure how much it applies to animals, since 99% of my work is with people. I know that antidotes definitely affect people. I've seen it sometimes, perhaps in relationship to vaccinations, also potentially in relationship to reactions from prescription medicines, but it's been very minor, and most of that's been secondhand with animals, because we don't give any of our animals, or at least here in Colorado, we haven't given any of our animals any prescription medicines at this point. Compliance is another issue that's really important. Did the patient take the remedy? You might think that after all the work that you've put in, and you tell your client, please give, either take or give the homeopathic medicine that you're prescribing in exactly the way that you're asking them to take it. It's always surprised me when patients, when I check back in, and I've expected them to let me know one way or the other, and it's been a couple of days past the point where I've expected to hear that communication, and they're telling me, well, my mother-in-law came to visit, surprise this weekend, so I didn't want to take the remedy before, while she was here, or fill in the blank, some other seemingly unusual circumstance that was their reason. Sometimes it's been, they started getting sick before they took the remedy, so they didn't want to take the remedy. And that's something that, has surprised me pretty strongly. Posology, I see this being a huge issue in terms of not 100% failure in regards to a remedy response, but and we'll get into this a little bit here later on, but interpreting the remedy response and how that fits into that interpretation. In other words, are you a 4th edition of the Organon prescriber, so it's dry dose, high potency? Are you a 5th edition prescriber, so you're working with centesimal potencies in water? Are you a 6th edition prescriber, so you're working not only with centesimal potencies, but also 50 millesimal potencies in water? So those are pretty important facets. I've seen that quite significantly in my practice. Polypharmacy, I think is problematic. Not something that we're going to get into at all tonight. But just the question that I have is, if you take more than one remedy at a time, which I have patients ask me that if they can do that periodically. My question back to them is, then how are you going to be able to tell me which remedy caused the positive response that we're looking for? And they pretty much never had the answer to that question to any sort of satisfaction. So then at that point, they're willing to to not take 2 remedies exactly at the same time. Multiple therapies in very specific circumstances. I've seen be an issue. It's not the top of the list, but I've definitely seen it have an effect. Return of old symptoms is more along the lines of, what does that tell you in your practice, and then how do you use that information to to further the healing response of the remedy that you're prescribing. That's something that I think can be a very positive factor if you know how to interpret that information. Again, this isn't one we're going to talk about this evening, but it is definitely on the list, and actually probably higher than some of these other aspects here. The one place where we are going to focus is in this aspect of different scenarios in terms of how you interpret the response. And to start here, I just want to reference two great resources for looking at this. One I actually worked with years ago when I was in naturopathic school, and the other was probably not till 15 years later. So the one I started with was The Science of Homeopathy by George Vathoukas. And if you aren't familiar with this book, I highly, it's my, for me, it's the most accessible of what he's written. And especially when I was in school, it was a touchstone just in terms of looking at the perspective from someone who has been in practice for decades. But not only that, pretty much single-handedly was responsible for the resurgence of homeopathic medicine in the United States. Specifically, what he goes through is he has a section in this book where he lists 12 different remedy responses and the reasons why he thinks they happen. Everything from give one dose one time and there's a miraculous response, and he talks about that, to some of the other less dramatic or less miraculous responses to the remedy. So that's an excellent book, and I highly recommend that. The second book here by Luc de Schepper, Dr. Luc de Schepper, is Achieving and Maintaining the Simulum. And this book I love for even more so in terms of its overall perspective and truly working with Hahnemann's, what I think of as his advanced methods in the 5th and 6th edition of the Organon. So that's if you haven't had that study in your education and your schooling, and you're looking for a good book to introduce you to that, other than of course the Organon itself, then this is the book I would recommend. It's, as I said, I found it about 10, I guess it's 15 years ago now, and it was an evolution of what I'd first discovered in George Vathoukas' work, and with a bit more of a focus, well, not a bit, a lot more of a focus on actually utilizing these advanced methods of Hahnemann, the medicinal solution, use of the Q potencies, etc. So these are great books to look at for these response scenarios. And Dr. Luc also lays out 12 different scenarios. And again, from working from Hahnemann's writings, tells you about what you're seeing and how to work with it more specifically along the lines of the 5th and 6th edition prescribing. Since that's where I've practiced for the last quarter century, it was, for me, this was a much more useful description of remedy reactions, because this is the way I practice. I don't practice, dry dose, high potency. That just hasn't, from the very early days of my practice, probably the first year, really haven't utilized that approach. So I'm hoping that this might be a useful point to ask if there are any questions, what we've covered so far, before I dive into the one response scenario that I am going to talk about. So if you guys, either Jeff or or Susan, if you can look and see if anybody has any questions, and then just let me know what those are. I'll try and respond to them.
Yep, nothing from anyone. Henrietta, Judy, Stephanie, I think we can raise our hands to just pick your questions. Gregory, I have one regarding the obstacle of polypharmacy. Aside for, in addition to multiple remedies, does that include supplements and/or drugs?
Well, I wasn't actually considering that. I was thinking more of the combination homeopathic medicines, especially when taken internally. The whole issue of interference and possible negation of remedies from just from prescription medicines, that could potentially add a couple hours to the course that I did produce. The one thing I will say about that, Jeff, is this has been the way that I've worked with it almost from the beginning in practice, is that my assumption, and it's usually, it's borne out by what my patients tell me when they first see me, is that, the patient, when they are on, more than one drug, which is really pretty standard these days, that, even with that, they're still coming to see me for, say, the anxiety and depression, even though they're on, the antidepressants or the anti-anxiety meds, or they still have that severe hip pain that's been with them for a couple of years, either that, even though they've been on the, the most toxic anti-inflammatories, et cetera, for that whole period of time. So where, certainly there's lots of writers that discuss, the idea that, you have to, some of them go as far as to say that you have to take patients off their prescription medicines before you can treat them homeopathically. That's the part that I've just never gone that far. One, I haven't found it necessary, and two, as a naturopathic doctor, it's not my job to take somebody off their prescription medicines that have been, prescribed by some other type of practitioner. I've very often suggested when the patient is well that they go back to their practitioner and prescribe, whichever, prescription medicine or medicines, and said, look, to tell them, hey, I'm well, I don't need this drug anymore, right? So that the medical doctor, which, or the DO, has the opportunity to wean them off that med. So that's the way I've approached that particular conundrum.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. That was a good one, though. Like I said, it could probably add 1 or 2 hours to the course. While you were asking that question, anybody else happen to raise their hand?
Nope, no hands raised. Henrietta, Judy, Sue, Stephanie, any questions from you guys?
Okay. All right. Well, then we'll go to this idea of looking at response scenarios. Something that I see in my practice all the time is that there is a day-to-day variation in symptoms, whether they be mental, emotional, or physical. And that's pretty, that may seem like, okay, duh, that's not earth-shattering to recognize that. But where it comes into play is that as I understand my patient more and more during, our work together, the communication that we have, I discover the type of patient they are beyond what I'm able to learn in that first initial visit. I see whether there's someone that wants to treat every splinter and slight injury that comes up. I see whether their immediate response is to they want to stop their prescription medicines even before they get to their first follow-up, right? I learned these things about my patients so that I can choose better when to do something on the dynamic realm with the homeopathic medicine and when to approach that particular issue from a hygienic realm. And most of the time in between visits, I find that I spend a lot of that in the realm of hygiene. And by hygiene, I pretty much include everything under that umbrella that Hahnemann did. A lot about diet, a lot about lifestyle, where you live, even to the extent of things related to hands-on, what we might call energy work today. So those are the different aspects that I think of, and I'll ask people to work with instead of reaching for homeopathic medicine, every time something happens, so that we really don't get caught up in short-term shifts one way or the other, and therefore misinterpret what's going on, whether the patient's progressing or not. And for me, this is a bit of an issue, because I'm very hands-on with my patients. I'm in communication with my patients from visit to visit, typically more than one time, because we're especially early in their care, we're following their reaction to remedy. I'm doing this by email. I'm tracking whether they're better or worse, and deciding whether, if there has been some kind of hygienic insult, whether we need to address it hygienically, or if it does carry over into the realm of the dynamis and we need to do something homeopathically, so that this idea of the duration, the timeline, the history of their symptoms, not just from that first visit, but as we go along in care, really helps my assessment to figure out what is going on when it gets to the point where I have prescribed a remedy and quote unquote nothing's happened, or at least not the response that I expected to happen. And this has definitely changed. I hope it's improved over the years, because I've taken more cases. So then, what might stand out initially with the person, the individual, the client that you're working with, as you see more and more of that over time, you build a repertoire of understanding, and you can make those judgments much more quickly. Okay, I need to prescribe here homeopathically, or this is really, we have to check out whether or not this is a dietary issue before we make any changes with the remedy. It's just much more helpful the more you have those cases under your belt. And this really comes down to charting the responses, and the only thing you're going to remember is what you write into your chart. And in the beginning, that's perhaps less true, because all your cases stand out. But over time, as you have more and more, and you see some repeated names of disease more and more, to help you differentiate and really look at what's going on and understanding the reactions that your patients are having, you have to keep track of it all. And so for me, that means I have to add in the email interaction to what I'm writing with my chart notes at their follow-up visits that are in person. So I want to work with this one particular scenario, because I think it's pretty common. And this is where you give a remedy, you've made the best homeopathic prescription that you can. You're using repeated dose if necessary, and only if necessary. But if so, you're making sure to change the potency each time you repeat that dose by the succussions that you're utilizing every time you have them repeat a dose. Right? So that when the main symptoms are better, but they're not sure, and you're not sure about the chief complaint, right? So these are important aspects of the case. But the reason why the patient came in to see you is only slightly better. Now again, here there are some homeopaths who they will differentiate, and they'll say, well, there's what the patient thinks needs to be treated, and your decision as a homeopath as far as what needs to be treated, and those can be quite different. But the scenario I'm describing here is not that case. In other words, you and the client both agree that the chief complaint is what we need to address, right? And that's what you want to see change with your homeopathic prescription. Other important symptoms, what do they tell you when they change? So one of the aspects, the failing I think that happens is that this can lead you to change your remedy prescription much too quickly, right? Because the chief complaint didn't change in whatever period of time you expected it to change from the dosing that you had the patient do. For me, that's that first follow-up, which is about 4 weeks. And, you know, perhaps you're falling victim to the client's impatience. In other words, you know, they're contacting you 3 days after the first dose of the remedy, and they want to know why everything isn't better immediately. Even though they've been on that anti-inflammatory for 2 years and that left hip hasn't changed at all, you give them that homeopathic medicine and they want to see that left hip, they want to be dancing a jig, 3 days after you give it. Right? So it's their impatience that might move you to change a remedy too quickly. And in doing so, the first prescription, which may be the correct remedy, you leave it behind. And I find that it can be very difficult to return to the quote unquote correct remedy that you decide, months later that, boy, you really need to go back to that prescription of XYZ because you think, that's where the case went wrong. Because what happens is more and more as you take these different paths and you choose what end up being less indicated remedies, you're more and more confused. So a good example of this happened with SM, who presented with a severe case of chronic pelvic pain that occurred in between her menses. This was also associated with a cramping pain right before her menses, along with the depressed mood. She had recurring headaches throughout the month, difficulty sleeping, and a specific joint pain in her right hand and thumb. Based on the characteristic symptoms of her pelvic pain and symptoms before her menses, I prescribed sepia 30C in medicinal solution, meaning that I had her dissolve 1 pellet in 4 ounces of water with succussions before each dose, and proceeded from there. After the initial test dose, we determined that daily dosing provided the best response, meaning that she checked in after I typically have people do this 48 hours after that single initial test dose, and I have them tell me what shifted in that period of time. And with SM, what happened was the first day after that initial test dose, the pelvic pain was better, and it happened to be that she was getting close in time to her menses, so those symptoms were better. And also her overall depressed mood had lifted even with that first dose. Not completely, but enough that she mentioned it, right? But also part of that 48-hour check-in was she said, because this was now the second day, 48 hours later, that basically her symptoms had returned to where they were before that initial test dose. So that's what I mean by we determined that daily dosing was necessary, because that's what her response was to the remedy. So I had her dose once a day, and this wasn't ad nauseum, this was with periodic check-ins so that I can make sure that her response was what I expected it to be. So at her first follow-up 4.5 weeks later, the pelvic pain was actually only slightly improved since starting the remedy. So I think I must have misspoke when I was reading that earlier. So everything else changed after that initial dose, but not the pelvic pain. Okay, just slightly improved over the whole 4.5 weeks since starting the remedy. However, as we mentioned, the mood was better. She was actually sleeping better. She reported more energy in general, and the recurrent headaches had decreased in frequency. So, important symptoms, certainly important to her, all had improved during this time, but not very much with the pelvic pain, and that was her chief complaint. So my assessment was that the sepia was correct and that she needed more time to see results with the pelvic pain. And this has really been driven by experience, that this idea that, to wait at this particular junction. Because it's been rare in my practice to see the wrong remedy significantly improve energy, mood, and sleep, even when the chief complaint has not shifted that much. I really can't think of the last time that this wasn't the case. So I had her continue daily dosing with the sepia 30C in water with succussions before each dose. And according to her, her next menses was perfect. So this was her second follow-up. And at this second follow-up, she had no pelvic pain. And the PMS symptoms were gone as well. So if I had changed remedies at that first follow-up, when the chief complaint was not that much better, the case would have been disrupted. I don't think that we've been able to, go back in time at some future point and perhaps prescribe sepia again and seeing the kind of results that we saw in this case. It was, truly the maintenance, I believe, of the continued daily altered dose was necessary to bring about this resolution of her case in just a couple months period of time. Any questions about this case before there's a couple other things that we have time for that we try and fit in here before the end of the hour. Any questions on SM's case?
Nothing that I see here. Anything from you guys? Nope. Yeah. Okay.
So I want to mention actually incorrect posology is a possible reason why you make the assessment your remedy prescription has failed. And this is not something I've seen often. I'd have to say it's probably rare in my practice, meaning that less than once a month, probably in my practice. But I've seen it enough that I think it's important to at least have in a particular corner of your brain that you can actually give the similimum in a case, but whether or not you give the correct potency for that specific individual can make a difference whether they respond to that remedy or not. And I'd like to go back to the work of Jacques Van Veniste, because what he found, and I think this matches what I find in practice, is that he was basically using an anti-IgE antibody to stimulate degranulation of human basophils, right? And these very high dilutions, some of them were effective at degranulation and some of them weren't, meaning that, that it was the same, remedy, so to speak, the anti-IgE antibody, but different potencies of that same substance did not degranulate the basophils. So I've always thought of this as my understanding for how this might happen in practice. In terms of giving a remedy in potency and having it have little to no effect, and then using that same remedy, because it is very well indicated, in the smallest effective dose and with alteration of dosing when necessary if you're repeating the dose more than once. Last but not least, it just so happens that I had someone ask this question on a mentorship forum on Facebook that I helped moderate. And so I thought it was a good addition to our talk this evening. And what she was, this is actually a naturopathic doctor in practice who uses homeopathy significantly part of her practice. And I wasn't quite sure what she was asking, but we did drill down to figure it out eventually. Her initial comment was she found it difficult to address the situation where a patient is getting worse on a remedy, but there isn't any improvement in any of their symptoms. And what was confusing for me is this was in her mind, she writes this that, quote unquote, it wasn't a therapeutic aggravation, which I, really didn't understand what she meant by that. So what I dived into was the basic idea of what Hahnemann writes in the Organon for aggravation, similar or dissimilar aggravation. And though it's simply stated, sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult to understand in practice. So the definition of a similar aggravation is essentially when you give a well-chosen homeopathic remedy and the patient's symptoms that you prescribed upon, some of them get worse with the dose, and they also have a curative response in terms of some of the symptoms they had getting better. The fact that the similar symptoms that you prescribed upon are worse is a strong suggestion that you have the wrong potency. In the words of Hahnemann, the size of the dose is too large. And this is where the medicinal solution and working with the 5th and 6th edition prescribing comes in very handy, because you have a multitude of ways to modify that dose so that you don't have a similar aggravation when you next prescribe. You can change the amount of pellets that you dissolve in the medicinal solution. You can change the amount of medicinal solution. You can change the succussions before you have them give a dose. You can actually have them dosed by olfaction, etc. So all those different techniques can help you modify and eliminate the similar aggravation. Dissimilar aggravation is a little bit more stark in that when you prescribe a remedy, and this may have been what I think she was getting to, was actually a dissimilar aggravation. And all you see is essentially that they get worse and nothing else is improving. And this would fit into one of those response scenarios where you would consider that you do have a wrong prescription here, because the essence of the idea being that the only symptoms that have changed were ones that you did not prescribe upon. Sometimes that means they're quite strongly that it's symptoms that the patient is susceptible to. Maybe their chronic disease is focused around their GI tract, and you give the wrong remedy, and so they get new symptoms in their GI tract they've never had before, something along those lines. So I stated those two possibilities, and the conversation went on with this doc, and then what we really got into was more along the lines, when I actually got her to drill down a bit, was what do you do when it's ongoing symptoms and new symptoms, and those are the ones that aggravate. And here I think it is complicated because it is a mix, meaning that in part I see this in my patients when this happens, that it is related again to this idea of a similar aggravation. And so I really have to look at potency and how I have them administer the potency. I wait actually a fairly, I'll try pretty much every different permutation I can think of before I move on to a new remedy. Some of the shading here comes into play when Hahnemann talks about similar aggravations. Is it only the symptoms that you prescribed upon, or is it can it also be the symptoms that you didn't prescribe upon that worsen after that dose, that leads you to believe that it's a similar aggravation? Some of this happens when it's something the patient didn't tell you about, right? So I prescribe, they take that first initial dose, they check back, and then they say, well, you know what? Those headaches I always get, man, I had the worst one I've had in months. And I'm like, okay, I asked you about headaches and you never told me that you had periodic headaches, right? So, so it can be that kind of situation where that happens. Or, it's a new symptom that, to them, it's a new symptom because it showed up just in that period of time since they took the remedy. But when you get them to explore it a bit, you actually find out that, well, it may be new in the moment, but they've definitely had that symptom before in the past. And that brings a different slant to your understanding of what happens with that, what happened with that particular response to the remedy that you gave. So I found this discussion with this doc to be interesting because, again, these are day-to-day questions that we all have to think about, and we have to figure out, from case to case. Hopefully, our conversation for her gave her some, good different ways to approach it. And again, before we finish up for the evening, because we're pretty close to the end, if any of you have a question on this particular interplay in this conversation I just described, or anything else that I've talked about in the last hour, I'll ask one last time. And if anybody is brave enough to raise their hand and ask a question here, Jeff.
I'm going to be brave enough. It's Sue.
Hey,
Thank you, Sue.
If anybody else, if there's anybody else, I'm just looking at the question box too.
Yep, Karen has her hand raised.
Go ahead.
Karen, what's your question? You're unmuted.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Hi, Karen.
I just sent the question in a document, but I'll go ahead and try to just rephrase it. I'm super new at this, less than a year, and posology is still really difficult for me. And I had a patient that had a good response to what I thought was a really well chosen remedy. But then after he had a return of symptoms and I dosed him again at the same dose, he didn't respond at all. So I changed. So now I'm wondering if I should have perhaps stayed with the same one but gone higher. Any thoughts on that?
Well, just brief. I mean, there's a lot of permutations to that question, but briefly, my first question back to you actually is: were you dosing dry or were you dosing in water?
Dry. I haven't gone to any kind of water dosing at all yet.
So that's the first place I think of, because that's my bias. That's how I practice. So a consideration for me is, if that were to happen in my practice, I would at least, I have them dose again, modifying the dose as I've talked about this evening, through perhaps changing the amount that was given, changing the number of succussions before dosing. And I have seen that in exactly the situation that you just described, Karen, make the difference between little to no remedy response to then seeing a remedy response. So
okay.
In the brief time we have available for me to answer that question, that is my default approach there.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
You bet. Anybody else? And Karen, being that you say you're pretty new at this, welcome to a very amazing, wonderful science of medicine. You're going to have a lot of fun. Hard work, but a lot of fun.
Yes, absolutely.
Go ahead. Anybody else here right at the end that has a question, want to raise their hand?
I want to make a comment. I'll defer my question to another time, but I know that some of the attendees here tonight are fairly new to the art and science of homeopathy, and I would just really, again, speaking, from my bias, but also speaking from the 5th and 6th organon, I really encourage folks to start exploring other than dry dosing. It makes, I can't tell you the number of cases.
Here. Sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt. Yeah.
The number of cases that I sort of backed into it 25 years ago for a lot of different reasons, but the number of cases that both that I've treated and in folks that I've mentored over the years, that just exactly the scenario that Karen described, the remedy appeared to act and then it didn't act, or or you'd go up in potency and it aggravated, or you had some weird symptoms that showed up that you didn't know what to do with, and those remedies are lost. And people say, oh, I'm a baby homeopath and it wasn't a good selection, or I must have been wrong, or whatever. And most of the time I found is that if you go back to those well-selected remedies and dose them a different way, and hone your powers of observation and take about 3 doses a patient, you'll see a difference. And I think there's a lot of cases lost because of dry prescribing and leaving remedies far too quickly, because we expect these guys to be able to respond in milliseconds when they really need days and weeks and a longer period of time to make a response.
I'll agree with both of you, with all of you. This is Judy. I've had the same experience, and even my acute cases, I use liquid remedies. I just have them dissolve it in a cup, and always have them stir it, and it's pretty amazing how gently and quickly the symptoms can change versus using a pellet.
Thanks for both Sue and Judy there for that confirmation. I appreciate that. If I'm allowed to do some shameless self-promoting here at the very end, I produced a course last year called Homeopathy and Practical Case Management. That's 6 hours, basically going over 5th and 6th edition prescribing. So if that's something that somebody might be interested in finding out about, you can email me at the email that I had at the beginning here, gpacend@gmail.com. And I just want to thank the AVH for the opportunity to share this with you folks tonight. Appreciate your participation, and looking forward to perhaps doing this again sometime in the near future.
We gotcha.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks, Gregory.
Good night.
Good night, y'all.